I'm just back from walking some of the pilgrimage way to Assisi, following quite literally, often, in the footsteps of St. Francis. And it set me thinking once again about Francis. What is his significance, which really can hardly be overstated? He comes at the end of the medieval period, and within 100 years, the clear lineaments of the Renaissance, of the beginnings of what we now call science, of a shift right across Europe are in full flow. It's remarkable that figures like Roger Bacon, William of Ockham, Duns Scotus, they're all Franciscans. I think Francis helped Western Europe to integrate the insights of Aristotle into its modes of consciousness. So this figure is not just the wonderful, slightly sentimentally portrayed lover of nature, brother sun and sister moon. He is plunging much more deeply into his times, which have become our times. And it was this vision of Francis that is at once as unsettling and disturbing as it is inviting and expansive, that walking the pilgrimage way stirred within me. I think this can be conveyed by considering the background to the times in which he was born, the end of the 12th and then into the 13th century. It's the period in which feudalism has well and truly come to an end. There's been the rise of the mercantile classes, the development of banking, and Francis's own family are very much the beneficiaries of this. He is born into this boom town of Assisi, and his family have the new money. But with that end of feudalism and the beginnings of mercantilism comes boom and bust, the winners and the losers, and it deeply disrupts and disturbs European society. Medieval feudalism, for all the ways in which it's easy to critique now, seems to have sustained a stability in society. There were the lords, there were the serfs, but there were bonds of connection, and the sense that whilst your place was fixed, it was fixed relatively securely, in as much as that can ever be achievable. But with the end of that and the new money flowing in, there's the development of an underclass. The old city-states with their walls, like Assisi, start to witness the rise of the poor who live outside the walls, who can't be looked after adequately by the old religious orders following on from Benedict. And there's a sense of precariousness, therefore, that weaves its way throughout society. You might do well, but you might do so badly that you fall off the edge altogether. There's the constant threat also that I think rises of plague, of infection, which the new trading routes, of course, become vectors for that kind of disruption as well. So we're living in Francis's era a century or two into this new, deeply destabilised way of life. But there's more. Islam is being felt keenly, particularly in southern Europe. It's pressing up through the lower part of the Italian peninsula. It's well and truly established in the Spanish Iberian Peninsula. Cordoba has passed its peak, and yet you can imagine that the memory of that extraordinary city, easily the biggest in Europe at its peak, an amazing centre of learning and architecture that was intimidating as much as alluring, and all the knowledge, all the technology, all the high culture that had been brought to the western part of the continent by this extraordinary Islamic empire until the British Empire, the largest empire the world has known, that is as much inviting as it is intimidating. How is Western Europe going to absorb this and not be overwhelmed by it? How is a way of life going to be forged around the new technologies that don't drain the old ways away? How is Christianity going to fare against this new learning? And there's also another threat, not felt quite so soulfully as Islam is in a Christian world, but there's the threat of the Mongols too. Their conquests have also reached to what we now call Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and the world into which Francis is born, therefore, feels surrounded. It feels like it hasn't got the power, the means, the wisdom, the depth in order to survive these threats, which may conquer them quite literally or conquer them by their learning, by their technology. The two crusades before Francis were born, the First Crusade and the Second Crusade, are in some ways responses to that. When the First Crusade was preached, I think the Pope probably only wanted to reach out to Byzantium to offer the help of the West, secure passage for pilgrims to Jerusalem, which of course had been in Islamic hands for 4.5 centuries. And yet the Pope preaching the Crusade seems to have unleashed a great fountain of feeling, both amongst the knighted classes who could don their armour, take their horses and go on noble crusading into the Holy Land, but also the poor. He seems to have unleashed the pent-up frustrations, fears, longings, yearnings amongst the poorer classes too, who quite, I think, to the Pope's surprise, swept east as well towards Jerusalem, which wasn't just about a military conquest, but was about a spiritual hope. There, maybe they would find the stability, find the comfort, find the peace and security that wasn't being found now in their own times. As much as spiritual yearning, of course, the New Jerusalem as an actual political hope. The Second Crusade just amplified these feelings, not least when it was preached by that tremendous miracle worker, that living saint, Bernard of Clairvaux, founder of the Knights Templar, reformer of the Cistercians. And that brings us to another facet of this time, which is the rising up of all sorts of religious figures and movements. On the one hand, you have the Brethren of the Free Spirit, and you can imagine people in their local town seeing these Christian enthusiasts coming down in their gang towards the town, and you wondered, what miracles am I going to see? What extremes of behaviour, flagellations are we going to witness? What person is going to stand and declare that they're the new Messiah, asking us to ask ourselves, can this be true? What might be the meaning of this? You've also got the development of these wonderful movements called the Beguines and the Beggards, particularly these women who lived neither within the institution of marriage nor within the institution of the religious house, but formed their own communities, becoming increasingly influential and felt across the land, particularly in the cities, partly through the welfare they're offered, but partly also as well because of, to the church, this disturbing intimacy with God that they brought, this sense of proximity that the divine might break through. And whilst that held great promise for those who followed these people, it held great sense of threat to the church, because not just about ecclesiastical power, of course, but the instability that this brings. Religious enthusiasm is very ambivalent. There are those who in time one can admire, Marguerite Porete, Catherine of Genoa, others. But at the same time, what happens when that kind of hope, that kind of direct contact with the divine, works its way right to the base of society? It's easily open to abuse, easily open to extremes, easily open to damage as much as new life. The Cathars are perhaps the group that we remember more now than anywhere, because of the Albigensian Crusade, because of the way that the church responded. Again, something that Francis would have known all about. The word genocide itself was coined to try and capture the extremity of the response to the Cathars. But the Cathars were a very mixed group too. They believed in a kingdom of death that existed in the sublunary world, the world of transience, of time, of living and dying, and that there was a need to embody a kind of knowledge in those that they called the perfects, to be released from these cycles. Some have speculated they might well have been influenced by notions of reincarnation, others that they're a kind of neo-Manichaean sect, believing that there was a great war between good and evil underway in their time. They're called the Cathars because, like cathartic, they stood for a kind of cleansing. They were vegetarian, probably not because of their feeling for animals so much as their horror at the way that animals fed on each other, a sign of this sublunary trap. They, of course, appealed greatly when they stood in contradistinction to immensely rich, no doubt often corrupt clergy and monks. The excess of the Catholic Church, of course, stood out, and their contrast would have drawn people, which was part of the politics. They eclipsed the Catholic Church in terms of loyalty in parts particularly of France and Northern Europe. So you can imagine the response to the Cathars as feeding this sense of disruption. It was almost like Northern Europe turned against Southern Europe, a kind of internal crusade as well as the crusades to the east. And so you have this ferment where many people would be called heretical. Anyone could be called the Antichrist, even often the Pope. There were lots of messianic leaders. There was the sense of novelty and miracle and new technology and new possibility thrown into the mix alongside terrible apocalyptic feeling, like this Christian civilization was undoing from within. It was too ignorant, it was too sinful, it was too confused. It had lost its way on its excess, on its inability to rise to the challenge of the times. The crises were compounding, they seemed intractable, and so the fierce rhetoric and biting language became part and parcel of the times. And into this, St. Francis is born. And if you can say one thing about him, I feel now, it's that he took this tension, he took these contraries, to use William Blake's expression, into his life, onto his very body. And by living the impossibilities of the times, that which seemed so destined to fall, that which seemed so impossible, he lived those extremes in his embrace, particularly of poverty. And when people felt that spirit, they felt reality tearing itself open, and into that opening came a sense of new possibility, new life. Much as Dante was to walk right onto the body of Lucifer to find that the way down had become the way up, so Francis embraced to the fullest extent the polar contradictions of his time, and by never letting up, opened a new sense of spirit, even as the tensions continued and the way of life that he strove to live and insisted his followers live as well stayed impossible to achieve. But look, first of all, a bit more about Francis in terms of his biography. He comes from this prosperous town of Assisi, his own family's wealth coming from cloth, and he starts out enjoying life. He is part of the boom class, and so he dons his armour, he gets his horse and sets out on escapades as a wealthy knight around the Italian peninsula, seeking a war to thrill him, seeking a fight in which to make something of his name. But he's captured, he's wounded, and for maybe a year or so, he is very sick. And during that time, he was later to say he read the chivalric romances of the era, these tales of knights seeking to impress impossible ladies who they couldn't reach married to the Lord, but in that tension, finding they achieved noble deeds that they otherwise wouldn't have known how to reach towards. But these chivalric romances worked on Francis in a different way. He realised that the lady he needed to woo was Lady Poverty, and his conversion begins during this time. The ransom was paid, he returned to his family, but as he picked up the pieces of his life again, his parents noticed that he had changed. And then he has this famous experience in the church of San Damiano, just a bit down from Assisi itself, where the crucifix speaks to him and Christ appears by his side, saying, "Repair my church that has fallen into ruin." And it's a great insight into Francis' spirit that he takes this quite literally, and he starts to rebuild the church of San Damiano, brick by brick, fresco by fresco, siphoning off his father's wealth in order to do so. There's something that is at once inspiring and terrifying in Francis, even in that act. By pursuing things literally, he doesn't become a fundamentalist, but he finds a path into the heart of the challenges of the time. This is partly what his parents were noticing, worrying about, wandering, and so his father speaks to the bishop, and there's then the other famous scene where Francis is brought before his father with the bishop by his side to try and persuade him to see his senses. And then there's the famous scene in the marketplace of Assisi where Francis is brought with the bishop by his side before his father to try and achieve some sort of reconciliation, some sort of sensible sense making. But instead, Francis throws off his clothes, discards all his wealth, turns, as it were, in his heart towards Lady Poverty, and tells the assembled throng, again, wanting to see what was going to happen, wanting to see whether a miracle might occur, whether a new Messiah might be born, and hearing Francis say that now he has only one Father, his heavenly Father, and he will live in that kingdom from now on. He starts preaching, he starts living the life of extreme asceticism, and of course many just think he's mad, he's gone crazy, he is as much a part of the fallen state of the times, not an answer to it. But he starts to attract just a few followers and engage in acts that move some people, not just challenge them, kissing the lepers, embracing this life. But all the time he's pushing himself more and more to these kind of extreme points at which the tensions of his world are most keenly felt. One of his early followers, Brother Leo, there's a story that Francis asked Leo to put his foot on his neck and to push down as hard as he could. And Leo says, but Master, I love you. And Francis said, well, in that case, you will show me the horror of my sin. You will show me the worthlessness of my soul. And Francis, I think, is not just feeling some kind of private existential horror at himself. He's feeling the difficulty of the times. He's feeling the impossibility of his age. He's feeling that something has come undone. And rather than trying to solve it rationally, trying to solve it imaginatively, trying to solve it even spiritually, he's just entering into it in the manner of life which he leads. His few followers stay, and they gradually start to grow because, of course, when you live on the edge of reality, when you're close to tears in the very fabric of being, strange things happen, and there are miracles, and there are healings, there are levitations. Francis is one of these extraordinary figures whose levitations are witnessed by many, many people. And he also bilocates. And once again, these things are hard to just discard, I think. Because, for example, one of the stories is that when his now French followers needed to consult him, he appeared in their midst and advised them. And the advice that they received was precisely the same as the advice that Francis was giving back home on the Italian peninsula. There wasn't an email exchange that could be had to confer and to make sure the advice was coherent. Francis is able to draw his followers together by the very extremity of his witness. It's said that he dealt with others as if he knew their thoughts, a kind of clairvoyancy. And then, most famously of all, Francis, towards the end of his life, was to receive the stigmata, the first saint to know in his body the very wounds of Christ. He hides the wounds at first, which it seems were protuberances as much as holes. But of course, when you're living with that kind of effect on your body, you can't hide it for long. And people realise that he now has become a kind of second Christ. He's recognised as a saint before he dies. The hundreds of people have become thousands across Europe even before he's on his deathbed. And Francis has unleashed something tremendous that, whilst discomforting, horrible in the minds of many, somehow also is recognised as key to Western civilization, Christianity, engaging with the times, searching in the depths of its soul to find something that can release a new spirit. The sun rises, it's said. Assisi is a word that plays on the notion of rising. And if you've ever been there, you'll know that the town seems to rise up the mountainside. And this new order, the Franciscans, which receives the blessing of the Pope before Francis dies, becomes, I think, a focus alongside the Dominicans, alongside the Augustinians, that can live the tension but hold the tensions together. This is the difference between the friars that were authorised by the church, that's often seen as a kind of compromise. And I think in a way, of course, it is. I mean, the Pope couldn't have a schism on the Italian peninsula, much as there had become a schism in French lands with the Cathars. That would be too close to home. So there's undoubtedly great political forces at work in the bringing in, the holding in of the Franciscans in the fold. But I think more substantially, really, the point is that the tensions of the time can be lived without them pulling the times apart now. Francis stands for a way not of reaching for any quick solution, not even really of wholly understanding what's going on, but his followers, although they soon start to fall away, of course, the impossibility of the poverty that Francis had called them to, nonetheless, there's enough authenticity in what they are able to sustain that is felt by many not to be an answer to the times, but to triangulate the difficulties of the times between the contraries so that a new sense of what it was to be human starts to be born. He had been in the world, wholly immersed in the world, and yet wholly not of the world at the same time, as indeed had another of his famous followers who became her own source of inspiration to others, Clare, founding the Order of Poor Ladies that became the Order of the Poor Clares. She was from old money, not new money, and her family tried physically to stop her following Francis, setting up her own order. And it was when she'd shaved her hair, this great symbolic act, which it would be sacrilege to transgress, that they finally relented. Francis finds her a place in an order of Benedictine nuns at first, but she soon has her own convent built and forms her own community around her, adopting to the extreme asceticism that parallels Francis, rooting in another place and another way, in the cloistered life rather than the mendicant life, that which it was felt they needed to witness to the wider world, that the wider world might sometime start to realise it needed. It's rebuilding the church as Francis had heard Christ speak to him, not physically in terms of building, not ecclesiastically in terms of the structures of the church, but spiritually in the sense of the divine presence could be felt once more in the lands that had become so full of their own excess, so fearful of that which was unfolding, that they had lost that sense of the soulful. And just to reflect in a couple of ways on how this rippled out across Europe over the next 100 years or so. One, of course, was the great Franciscan intellectuals who followed. Take Roger Bacon. He is an Englishman from the Bacon family, no doubt well-to-do. He famously becomes an independent scholar when he becomes dissatisfied with the curriculum of Oxford and how it seems to be constraining his sense of what the world needed. He spends the enormous sum of £2,000 to set up his library and his equipment. And I think Bacon was able to do this because he was a Franciscan, not in spite of that. Because what Francis's spirit of focusing on that which was most essential, moving through that which seems like the breaking point to make contact with something fresh, that is precisely what you needed if you were going to properly and fully engage with these teachings of Aristotle. So Aristotle had been coming into Europe through the Islamic Empire. The great commentators on Aristotle, such as Averroes, were already inspiring tremendous figures like Thomas Aquinas. But what the Franciscans were able to bring to that wasn't just the intellectual engagement, but a kind of love, a kind of passion that realised that the Aristotelian way, with its great stress on observation, not just on reflection, with its great sense of loving the world in order that the world could speak more powerfully to the observant scholar. You see, the point about Roger Bacon wasn't that he was a proto-scientist, as he was corralled into being in the 19th century, when the sense of science as we have it now was fully born, and there was the need to establish a kind of tradition in order to lend it legitimacy. Roger Bacon, much like his spiritual father Francis, was absolutely committed to the sense of the apocalypticism of his times. He felt that nothing less than a complete overhaul was required, head and heart, mind and body. A new spirit was needed, and you see this in his writings to the Pope, Clement IV, with whom he seems to have been a friend and advisor, warning the Pope about the dangers the West faces. He says that people aren't seeing clearly because of their ignorance, because of their sin. Their very way of life is stopping them tackling the challenges of the time. They become too trapped by their habits, by their instincts. He says that there's a need to recover a knowledge that has been lost in the ephemera of the times. He sees false authorities proliferating. He realizes that there's new learning coming from Islam and from Aristotle, but thinks that Christianity needs to establish its own mode of engaging with these things. He's very much part of the Doomster mood, but is able to not just wring his hands at it, not try and bring the familiar tools to address that which is going on, but discover a new mode through this new movement of the Franciscans. He shocks people by his writings on epistemology. We need to know things in new ways. He disturbs people by saying we need to study Hebrew, Arabic, for goodness sake, Greek, in order to understand the spirit of what is being communicated. He stresses the need for grammar, the way that the world in our language needs to be put together in the proper ways in order that the depth of reality can come through in the way we speak, it being a reflection of the divine word working through all things. But he also stresses the need for a way of life, a kind of cleansing of the spirit, so that your soul can resonate with the divine soul, so that your virtues can be open to receive that which is from God. He knew about other religions as well as Islam. He writes about Buddhism and assesses them comparatively. He draws on figures like Seneca and the Stoic attitudes to things. But above all, it's like this scientia experimentalis, this way that you used your own engagement with the world in your body as well as in your mind to lead you into a new understanding of the world. Aristotle and Francis then, I think, go together. They're experiential in the richest possible sense, not just taking measurements, but allowing your experience to draw you into the world around you and seeing where that leads. Observation matters, of course, mathematics matters, of course, but a soulful transmission is at the heart of it. So Roger Bacon, the Franciscan, becomes one of the key figures in this new learning. His Franciscanism is not just his private pursuit that kept him sane on the side. It's absolutely integral to the response to the times that he himself quite clearly feels absolutely palpably. He's fascinated by light, for example. And this isn't just in the sense of optics, though he did read the great Islamic texts, on influence, on optics. He did countenance the possibility that rays come into our eyes, not just rays going out of our eyes. He understood that geometry and aesthetics is required to understand optics. But light fascinates him because all lights are a reflection of the one light, the source, the wellspring. And so if you study light at the experimental level, it might draw you into the origin of light, that which is beyond light, the uncreated light. That was what his science, so-called, enabled him to engage with, which is why his learning becomes so important for remaking the times, not just trying to fix problems. The tension of the times is lived out even in the midst of the Renaissance, the new learning, because, as historians of ideas will inform us now, nominalism is born out of the Franciscan spirit as well, particularly in the figure of William of Ockham. His great competitor in this debate is the other Franciscan figure of Duns Scotus. And I think what this is about is working out how we can have a new triangulated relationship with the natural world, with creation. Duns Scotus had been an adherent to the sense that the manifestations, the many things, the entities which surround us are as many reflections of universals, of a divine source, of the one itself that had been attacked by his near contemporary William of Ockham, he of Ockham's razor. But again, in that squabble, now many realise, is the fight for our own sense of connection with nature. How are we to know ourselves if not just as isolated individuals? How are we to know our thoughts and our feelings as if not just the products of independent organic bodies, but rather as in a flow of meaning, a flow of reception, a flow of revelation that we might be invited to become co-creators with? Duns Scotus against William of Ockham in this. And I think this hugely matters now. This is where the Franciscan spirit might speak to us now. The last Pope, Pope Francis, was onto this with his famous encyclical on ecology, stressing elements which are readily grasped, that this earth is our one home, that we need to develop a love and praise for it, moving our hearts towards it, as well as relating to it in the ways that we must out of utility. But there's a deeper sense here, which is, can we regain the consciousness once more where we see the divine reflected in the many things around us? Again, William Blake, I think, is so important here because of his way of expressing this, seeing a world in a grain of sand, seeing heaven in a wild flower, holding infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. This is the triangulation of our relationship to the natural world that I feel is really going to be fundamental if we're not just to tackle the challenges of now morally through systems, no doubt, though that's important, but to rediscover again a remade consciousness that will allow us to live differently with the world around us. The possibility is even contained in the seemingly sentimental stories that were remembered about St. Francis. Take Francis's preaching to the birds. The story goes that he and his gaggle of followers were finding a place to say their office, and the noise from the birds in the trees around them was so much that the brethren complained they couldn't hear themselves speak. And so Francis speaks to the birds, and he discovers that they're offering their office, that they're preaching their praise to creation around him, and he realizes that they're collaborators. He invites the birds to turn the volume down for a few moments in order that the brethren can say their words, which of course they do. And then together, though, Francis realizes that all things are offering praise to God. The difference is that human beings have a kind of freedom of expression, not just an instinct to praise the divine, and that freedom is what we need to work on once more, to try and use our language to reach out to that which our consciousness might bring to us, and find therefore that in our speaking we get drawn more and more into that which is around us. Praise, you might say, needs to be something not just that we do in church as if some kind of patriarchal deity requires it, but is a very response from within our souls to the business of being alive. Another story, I think, says more than perhaps is immediately apparent. This is the story of the Wolf of Gubbio. Gubbio, a town in Tuscany near to Assisi, known for its wildness even to this day. And the story goes that there was a terrible wolf haunting the streets, killing people. And so the people of Gubbio reach out to the son of Assisi and ask Francis to solve this problem for them. Francis comes and visits, and he, of course, speaks to the wolf. He enters into the heart of the problem, addressing the source itself, and befriends the wolf, and invites the wolf to set up a new arrangement with the people of Gubbio. If they will feed him, will he not feed on them, but instead become part of their community, which is what happens. It's a lovely story that the people of Gubbio become friendly with the wolf and ask the wolf one day, sometime later, what happened? And the wolf says, well, I became a Franciscan. I knew that I could find greater riches in life by being poor myself, not trying to be possessive, but instead receiving from you Gubbians. Now look, a sentimental story, but what it talks about is the possibility that there can be a new relationship with nature. Depredation, that which had so disturbed the Cathars that they became vegetarians. Francis is saying, no, there's a different kind of redemption that's possible. This is born out of a real tension, of a real paradox, how are different creatures to live. It's not a solution so much as a discovery. And the discovery is made not because suffering stops, but because suffering can be transformed. Francis, again, never ceases to not live these paradoxes. He can praise the birds and praise with the birds, and yet still call his body foolish, refer to it as a donkey that must be beaten in order to not drag him down, but to do work for him. What he's advocating, I think, is not a kind of modern rational ecology, as if nature, even has its own harmonies that must somehow be restored. Rather, it's by knowing about the disharmony and difficulty the suffering, the death in nature, as well as yearning for the life, for the love, for the praise, that nature itself can be seen as a place into which the kingdom of God might be born. It is part of the emerging of a new consciousness, and staying on the threshold, in the liminal zone, staying at the crack in reality, staying at the place where the contraries are, they're most keenly felt. That, I think, is what Francis says to us today. And it's why it's a good message, why it's a useful message, because the contraries aren't going to go away, the tensions aren't going to dissolve, but by finding the faith, the vision, the inspiration from others like Francis, it might become possible to live with, and therefore to live through, the times, not through in a linear temporal sense, but through in this transcendent triangular sense, that from the heart of difficulty, taking it onto your very body, wedding yourself to the world in such a way that more than the world can start to be known, be felt, be seen. That is the Franciscan spirit. That is what his followers like Roger Bacon picked up. It's in there, woven into our mentality. But to my mind, it needs the sense, not just that we find ourselves to be brothers and sisters of our brothers and sisters in the world around us, the other creatures, the other things, the landscapes, the mountains, the rivers and so on, but in that siblinghood is found a shared source, a shared divine presence. Then the diversity can be held as one. Then the difficulty can be held even as peace is sought. Then the contraries which will continue on this plane of existence cease to be our enemies and start instead to be the very possibility for a new sense of things to be in this world but not of the world, which of course might lead to the New Jerusalem, the New Jerusalem that so many in Francis's times explicitly sought, so many in our times might unwittingly be seeking as well in the modern expressions, awaiting, you might say, to echo the words of Alistair MacIntyre, awaiting not a new St Benedict but a new Francis.